Miko, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm doing okay. Um,
Uh,
I'm usually upbeat and in a sort of a really optimistic mood. No matter what's happening. But I do have to admit that the events over the past week have been kind of challenging. And I know that lots of folks are trying to process what's going on, and there's a lot of hurt and a lot of healing that I think needs to take place. And so I do want to acknowledge that, but uh, notwithstanding that, so I'm well. Family and friends are well, and so I appreciate you checking in. So how are things for you on the West Coast?
yeah, I mean, I think similarly, just kind of going through this like mixed bag of emotions and really like sense to or need for like just being able to like stand up and show up for our friends, family, community, given the injustices, given what's going on. It's just kind of like, yeah, walking around a bit heavy hearted. So one, thank you for taking the time now to kind of acknowledge the situation. I think as we welcome Robert, our today's guest, we might benefit from even designating some additional time to discuss it further. But yeah, I mean, I think overall family's healthy, fortunately, and we happen to be, safe. I mean, the community that I live in Long Beach, California, was one of the routes, if you will, for protesters that turns into whatever. And there was a good showing from protesters and support from local police and government entities, and so that was something that, as a community, I think we felt very proud of, let's say. But yeah, it still sort of comes in a time where this sort of uncertainty is taking place. So thanks for asking, though.
Yes, and thank you for sharing it. So for folks that aren't aware, so I live in Maryland, just outside of DC, and so that's my connection to what's happening. And for folks that are following what's going on, there's been a lot of activity in DC. There's been a lot of destruction, a lot of chaos in the immediate downtown area for the DC area. So um, definitely hope that we have an opportunity with our guest today to talk about that in the context of today's topic. And one of the things that's interesting, I was thinking about this before today's show, is that together the three of us represent, I think, a really diverse range in terms of tech nerds. But I also think that we bring to this conversation um, a a diversity of life experience,
Yeah,
particularly as it concerns the race piece. And so I'm excited to have Robert be a part of this conversation and appreciate his flexibility in allowing us to be responsive to what's happening in real time as we talk about today's issue.
I want to bring Robert on now. Hey, Robert.
Hi, Carlos. Hey, Miko.
Hey, Robert. So for folks that are just joining us, so we are honored to be joined by Robert Plotkin, who is the founder of Mindfulness for Technology. He is a computer scientist, an alumnus of MIT. Yes, that MIT. He's a patent attorney and all around great guy, passionate about mindfulness and technology. And I'm excited that Robert is going to be joining us today to talk specifically about what it means to approach work from home from a mindful and intentional space. So since we've made this transition to work from home, most of us who are knowledge workers working from home, there's been a lot out there about the technology piece, how you work from home. There's been a little bit about work from home culture and the impact that's having on us and with the prolonged physical distancing that we're experiencing, but not a lot in terms of how we're processing and moving through things and approaching things from a mindful and intentional space. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm always excited to have conversations with Robert specifically about this particular topic. And so, Robert, I just want to pause and ask you. So, how are you doing? Tell us where you are, how are you doing, and how, if at all, have you been impacted by the news of the last week or so?
Yeah, I mean, overall, obviously, I'm impacted in a lot of ways, like many people. I've been working from home for a little over 2 months, but you know that before that, I was working from home much of the time, but now 100% of the time. I'm in central Massachusetts. I had an office in Boston, so I haven't been in the city of Boston. So probably less adaptation than for most people, but still, not interacting with people in person. The one trip I make out of the house a week is for grocery shopping. I feel very fortunate in terms of mindfulness, practicing a lot of gratitude, for how much I have in terms of safety and health, ability to work and maintain my living, which is mostly as a patent attorney remotely. I feel a lot of gratitude and try to focus intentionally on that gratitude
Yes.
for all of those things, knowing how much of a divide there is in this time between people who just out of fortunate coincidence are able to continue their livelihoods remotely doing work on a computer or otherwise, and those who for no fault of their own have not
Yes.
been able to keep working
Yes.
overnight. And I know in my conversations with you, I've mentioned feelings of guilt around that, turning from feeling compassion for people to guilt towards in relation to my own good fortune while I see people around me just because of how they happen to earn their living, being put in a very different economic circumstance than me. And I do find mindfulness practice very helpful to deal with that guilt, which, for those people who are listening who aren't mindfulness practitioners, one thing mindfulness helps you do is neither push away a feeling like that of guilt and just push it down and
Yes.
avoid it, or obsess over it or let it
Yes.
spiral. Those are the two extremes that we can tend to go to, kind of an obsessive rumination on something like guilt that can spiral out of control, or just not letting ourselves feel it. But
Yes.
mindfulness, we can
Yeah.
feel that guilt, and as we say, it arises and it keeps arising in me, but it's not taking over my life, and I'm letting myself feel it. And turning to the events of the last week or so, trying to practice doing the same thing. I mean, so many feelings arising. One is I happen to be in a location where I'm not directly physically affected. I'm not like you in an area where there are protests going on. I'm in a fairly rural area in Massachusetts. But of course, just personally, I'm deeply affected by it, and I have a lot of feelings of anger about what's going on in terms of the historical context. I'm sure many people feel the same way, that with everything that's happened in this country, these kinds of incidents, after each one, I feel like it can't get worse, and then it does.
Yes.
And then it does, or people will have to change and they don't.
Yes.
And so, I have a lot of feelings of frustration around that. And it's such a mix of feelings of seeing things. One is great pride and connection with so many people in the country taking action,
Yes.
positive action,
Yes.
joining with each other, feeling compassion for each other, and not just feeling it, but acting on it.
Yes.
And feeling, of course, the resentment towards the people who are behind the recent events, towards many politicians, towards people trying to leverage this to divide, and leverage this for their own personal gain or for the gain of some small group. And in this time when we're all on our devices, I am getting as much information as I can from various media sources, some of which have been amazing, and others of which I think have been, focusing on some of the worst. And so I have a mix of feelings around that. I know you wanted to talk about media consumption, so maybe I'll stop there. But
Yeah. I think I mean, this is just a really good, segue for us. And I do want to, I want to come back to what you mentioned at the top of the conversation about the guilt and the work from home survival guilt. So definitely want to talk about that. But let's dive into what's top of mind right now in terms of the media consumption. So I've been writing and reflecting, and for folks that are following me on social media, one of the things that I've been talking about this week is this concept of outrage fatigue, right? Where we're inundated with information and news about traumatic events, about suffering throughout the world. And in this case, this last week, we're talking about police brutality, specifically in the context of the relationship between Black people and the police. And what repeated exposure to that does to us, right? And we have a range of emotions that, as you alluded to, if I were to put them on the spectrum, I would say that they range from somewhere from outrage to apathy, and the connection to the technology, being connected essentially to a 24/7 news cycle, having access to more tools and information than we've ever had before. That, I believe, exacerbates the challenge that we have. And one other thing I want to add to that is I posted yesterday about the traumatic nature of being exposed to this repeatedly over and over again, right? That there is secondary trauma that we experience, even if we aren't directly involved in the events. There's a secondary trauma that we have experienced, and I've started calling this post-traumatic information disorder, where we're inundated with all this information over and over again, and the nature of the devices, the nature of how rich the news and the images are, make it so that it's a real experience that we're having, even though we're not there in person. And so there's a secondary trauma that I think that we experience. And so I'm wondering, Robert, if you can, I guess, start wherever you feel like you can jump in there to talk about this.
Yeah, I'd come back to this, the idea of a middle path in mindfulness, which is neither being averse to feelings and pushing them down or avoiding them on the one extreme, or obsessing over them and cycling over them. It's the same thing with news and media information. I can feel in me the tendency in a time like this. I mean, first of all, just with the coronavirus, before the latest issue with George Floyd and the other recent events, a tendency in me to just check the news constantly. And I'm someone who practices and teaches about how not to do that. And yet this latest situation has put that to the test in me. Where my mind can tell me, and not without any justification, Robert, you need to check more frequently than before, because you might be missing out on legitimately valuable, critical information that you need to act on. So, but the balance I find is between, just like with all mindfulness, the helpful thing I found to practice is when my mind tells me that, to not just act on it reactively. The mindfulness practice is step back and say, okay, that's the thought that's arising, or the urge that's arising, to check. Let me pause for a second before I act immediately and try to apply my rational mind and get in touch with my feelings, and then make a decision about whether to go back to a news site or Twitter or something else. That insertion of the pause is extremely helpful, because otherwise we'll all, and I'm included, easily get into a reactive cycle.
So I think you just said something really important. I want us to back up a little bit. So you talked about mindfulness, and you've mentioned it several times. So for folks that are listening to this, that are new to this, can you back up and tell us what is mindfulness, and what's the connection between mindfulness and this conversation that we're having now about tech and information consumption?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I could say a lot. I'll keep it brief. People often use the John Kabat-Zinn definition of mindfulness, which is paying attention from moment to moment to your experience without judgment. So let me apply it specifically to this. I'm sitting and doing anything. I might be eating my breakfast, and I feel the urge to check the news, and I feel tightness in my chest, maybe some anxiety, missing out. Oh, maybe something just happened in the news I need to learn about. So where mindfulness comes in is by practicing it through meditation and in other ways. uh, I can notice that that is a set of experiences I'm having. A thought, Robert, check the news. A feeling, heart racing, that's a physical sensation. Some other feelings, anxiety, fear. And I can actually step back from all of those internal experiences and see them in the moment, not in an analytical way, like think about them, but experience them from a distance. Um, and one practical benefit of that is I then can create some space in which to make a choice about whether and how to act
Yes.
instead of reflexively reacting to my thoughts and feelings and just doing something like jumping onto Twitter and streaming through the latest news feed.
Yes.
I have often found, and I speak to people all the time who talk about the feeling as in, I have to check the news.
Yes.
Why did you spend an hour, scrolling through Twitter? Well, I had to. I mean, I got this, I felt afraid, and I had to check the news. And I found for myself, whenever I feel this feeling of have to, it's a good warning sign for me that that's a time to step back, because even the feeling that you have to is a belief. It's a thought that you have to, or a feeling that you have to. It's not necessarily an objective fact of reality that you have to. You don't have to go on your phone. There's nothing physically forcing you. What's happening is there's some combination of feelings and thoughts that are creating a tendency in you to do that, but you don't have to. And stepping back is a way of creating an opportunity for you to make a choice about whether to go and check the news or not. And over time, it can really help to develop that feeling that I have the ability to decide whether to keep going back to my device or not.
So
And
that's powerful.
yeah.
So
It's a way of, and people talk about it as a way of being liberated, and if
Yes.
that's too much for you, you might just think about it as a way of creating more choice and less of a feeling of being forced or having no choice but to keep checking your devices.
So that's very powerful. So what you've pointed to, if I were to just summarize, just starting with what mindfulness is, I would maybe summarize what you said in terms of mindfulness is about non-judgmental self-awareness, right?
Yeah.
So you take that non-judgmental self-awareness, and when that urge comes up, when those thoughts come up about, in this case, wanting to check the news, you're able to recognize that you have the urge, that you have the thoughts, but you're not the thoughts, right? You're just
Right.
observing the thoughts, and you're not judging them. You're not saying they're good or bad. You're not engaging in negative self-talk with
Right.
yourself about having had the thoughts. You're simply
Right.
acknowledging that those are the thoughts that exist, and you have a choice to either react or respond, right?
Yes.
So reacting is essentially uh, narrowing that awareness factor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And responding almost out of habit, right? And if
Yes.
you're responding rather, then you're doing what you just described, Robert, I believe, which is to be the observer, to take the step back, and then make an informed choice based on taking that pause and taking a step back to observe. So that makes sense to me, and I think maybe for some folks that are listening, in the context of a normal news cycle, quote unquote,
Yeah.
whatever that means, right?
Right.
But can you, if you haven't any ideas about this, uh, how do we approach this in a news cycle like what we've experienced over the last week, right? Where
Yeah.
you're dealing with a number of different layers, right? So on an institutional layer, the media,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is a prime opportunity for the media, and I'm sure that
Yes.
there are well-intentioned people in the media,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also, we have a corporatized media. And
Right.
so there's an incentive when things like what have happened over the last week to essentially make it wall-to-wall salacious coverage, right?
Yeah.
And to find like the most insatiable, salacious aspect of it and play that up over and over again. So you have that aspect of it. Then you have the collective nature of it, right? So you have so many eyeballs on it, friends, family, colleagues, it's on social media, it's on the news sites, etc. So you have that aspect of it. But then you go back to what I was talking about earlier in the conversation, which is the emotional impact, right? So how, if people are being triggered, this is not an ordinary day scrolling through Twitter. This is a different type of day scrolling through Twitter, right? So if people are being triggered on a deep level that has to do with multi-generational trauma, right? In terms of us as a country, how we interact and how we treat each other. How does one shift out of that place when you're responding from a place of such deep hurt?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't give any kind of easy answer to how to shift out of the place. And, as you know, and as you mentioned, mindfulness is about paying attention to what your thoughts and feelings are. And part of it is not only not judging them, but not actively trying to change them. I think it's something that's people who practice mindfulness know. It is true that by practicing mindfulness over a long period of time, it can have effects on how you feel. But in the moment, when you're reading the news about something that's going on now, it would be, it's not that mindfulness changes how you feel, or that your intention should be to try to change how you feel. Instead, the intention is just to pay attention, as you said, to however you happen to be feeling in the moment without judging it, meaning however you are feeling is okay to be feeling that way. It could be rage, it could be anger, it could be, thoughts of violence towards other people. Now that's hard to not have a self-judgmental thought, right? You could have a cycle of thoughts that happens in a few seconds, from sadness to rage to feelings of anger towards specific people or whole groups of people, towards wishing them harm, and then judgment about yourself. Oh my God, that's so horrible that I just felt that way or thought that way. And that cycle, I mean, I could spin out another 20 thoughts and feelings that could spiral in that way easily in the span of 10 seconds within your own mind. And in mindfulness practice, you would just keep noticing what those are and trying to set your intention to not judge yourself. And then, particularly for the people who haven't practiced mindfulness, I can't say don't judge yourself, because you might find a judgmental thought or feeling arise within you. And then what do? You set your intention to not judge the feeling of judgment, right?
Yeah.
And then that may not happen. I don't want to say it may not succeed, because this is not about succeeding or failing.
Well, it's a long-term,
kind of mental way of
ongoing practice.
Yeah.
So you said a few powerful things there. So one thing you said was that mindfulness doesn't take away the feelings, right? So mindfulness is a practice, it's a tool, it's a skill set, if you will, that allows you to approach life in a responsive way as opposed to a reactive way. So mindfulness doesn't remove the challenges that you face. Mindfulness just allows you to more skillfully navigate those challenges, right? From a place of greater self-awareness and I guess, and understanding your agency over how you can respond in particular situations. So that was one thing that stood out to me as you were sharing that. And then the second thing that I thought was powerful is that you mentioned that this point about judging the thoughts, right? So not judging the thoughts. So this is a critical part that when we talk about mindfulness isn't just about the awareness, but it's also about releasing the judgment that we have about what comes up in the awareness. And I can share an example related to this. I was last night, I was looking before I went to bed, I was looking and I this is something that I don't do. Like I generally do not look at the news or social media or anything. Like I'm generally shutting down things well before I go to bed. But I had this urge just based on what I was hearing from friends to just like to see what was happening and to see if there was something that I could do in terms of being of service and taking more action than I've already taken, right? So I was looking at the coverage of the devastation here in DC, particularly in the downtown area, and I found myself going through a range of emotions, right? And I became aware of that. And I became aware of the need to shut off what I was looking at. And so I think if I understand you correctly, whether one thinks of that, but whether one is conscious of that as a form of mindfulness, is that an example of how you would use it in a situation?
I think so. And, I think it's as long as you were aware of the thoughts and urges you had, and then you made a decision, I'd say a conscious or intentional decision, then it was mindfulness. And it's another important point that this example raises, which is it's not that whatever specific decision you made was right or wrong. That would be a way of judging the decision. What's important is that you made it intentionally. You made the decision intentionally rather than, as you said, reactively or automatically, like a robot would, like you're being programmed or out of your own programming. That's the important thing. Then whatever decision you make is one you've made freely. But it's really hard. It's really hard to break out of the judgment cycle of judgment layered on judgment layered on judgment. That the initial judgment happens. You read about something in the news, you get angry at the police, and okay, so that's a feeling of anger, and you could examine it. And then there's a part of you that judges yourself for being angry. Oh, if I were a better person, I wouldn't feel that way. I'm not being mindful enough or peaceful enough. And then you have a judgment about the judgment. And, that's in mindfulness called the second arrow, but those second arrows can really spiral out of control. And it can, so all you can do is keep practicing that whenever you notice the judgment, to practice stepping back and doing your best to not judge the judgment.
Yes. So thank you for that.
May or may not happen in any particular case. And then you keep trying.
Yes. Yeah. So it's an ongoing process. So I appreciate you sharing that. So Carlos, I saw that it looks like you're on the screen. Is there, do you want to jump in here? Is there anything you want to add to this particular section? I want to transition us more deeply into the work from home piece, but is there anything you want to share, Carlos?
Yeah, you know what? Let's keep the conversation going. I'd like to chime in here in a little bit, but I seem to be having a camera issue, so I apologize.
Okay. All right. Awesome. So let's talk about the context in which all of this is happening, right? So we're experiencing this, I would say, at an unprecedented time for the world, right? So we have this massive work from home and homeschooling experiment that kicked off earlier this year, several months ago, as a result of COVID-19, forced many folks to work from home, except the folks that are essential workers. Many of us who are privileged enough to be in a position where we're a knowledge worker and we can work from home. We've been spending time at home. In some cases, we are, with our roommates or with our, significant others. We have our cats and dogs, our plants and our goldfish. We have all those things going on, right? And we're sort of on lockdown, right? So what are some of the challenges that you're seeing? Because I'm just sort of describing to you what I'm seeing from
Yeah.
my peers and clients that I work with. But what are you
Yeah.
seeing? How would you describe where we are right now in terms of the work from home situation?
Yeah. I'd say, there's for people who weren't previously working from home, there was the massive challenge and stress associated with transitioning, overnight, essentially, to
Yes.
working from home while dealing with all of the other stresses. I mean, I'm not even talking about people who were sick or who had family members who were sick.
Yes.
That, of course, adds a lot to it. Or having to homeschool your children or take care of other responsibilities. Just the stress of transitioning to working from home was huge. So, I did do my best to help people remotely to start working from home, and I'm doing some more of that even now, helping people transition. But I'm finding people are struggling with just the practical logistics of it, the technology of working from home. But now that people have been doing it for a while, I'm finding people are still struggling with the internal aspects of it,
Yes.
maintaining structure, balance, boundaries, routines, working from home, where I found, because I've been working from home mostly for like the last 20 years, it's critical to intentionally and consciously create those boundaries in a way that you don't have to if you're working outside of the home, where the commute, the physical workplace, the structure of the job kind of create those boundaries, schedules, routines for you, um, in a way that you don't have to as much consciously create them for yourself. And so, people now, I'm finding, if they haven't created those routines, they're telling me, I'm finding it hard to just not work constantly. Assuming, people still have their job. Well, I didn't realize, I wasn't prepared to find that I'm just like working all day. Or if I'm not working all day, I'm kind of, I want to say snacking, but it's the equivalent. I work a couple hours and I stop and I work and I stop and I work and I stop. And it's kind of like an amorphous workday from the time they wake up at 6 in the morning until they go to bed at 10 at night. And it feels very draining to not have the boundaries.
Yes.
That's on top of the interpersonal boundaries from, being at home, as you said, with a spouse or children, and then the potential conflict of trying to work with people interrupting you, and how do you that's another big area. In particular, and this is not something I personally am having to deal with, but setting schedules and boundaries for homeschooling and taking care of children while trying to do your job from home
So
is a big one.
so you talked a lot about routines and boundaries and schedules, and how for folks that are used to working in an office, used to having a commute, that there were some structures that were in place that they took for granted. So
Yeah.
can you say more about what that is? Like for someone who is struggling, they're working in the office, they're suddenly at home they've been trying to figure this out over the last few months. Um, what do you mean when you say that, like, they had a structure or a schedule in place? Like, what can you say what that is, and how do they get that back?
Yeah. I mean, so everyone complains about their commute and how, boring and stressful and time consuming it is. But, but, or, and there is some benefit to the commute. You get in your car, you get on the train, and it creates some headspace in which to mentally transition from home personal mode into
Mhm.
work mode. So that when you arrive at your workplace, you've made that switch to, oh, I'm in my work mindset now. That's lacking if you just wake up and walk down the hallway to work in another room in your house. Or some people, they don't have the space, they're working in their bedroom. So there's many ways to try to create that transition and boundary at home. One example is to do your best to set up a separate space, and if you don't have a room, it could be a curtain or a divider or something else. Why? That kind of signal, when you walk into that other room or put up that curtain and you see it and you're physically positioned in it, it can help act as an external trigger or reminder to you, now I'm in another space. Let me just give you a quick analogy, from my own mindfulness practice, which originally came primarily from martial arts training. When you start a class, you bow. And what I was often taught, when you walk into the school, or dojo in Japanese, you bow when you walk in. And what I was taught was there's an internal aspect to that. You walk in, and when you bow, you draw your mind to the thought and feeling, I am now entering this space. I'm leaving the outside world behind me. I'm going to focus my energy on my training while I'm in this space. And you use that few seconds of the bow to make that mental transition. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And you don't have to do it literally with a bow, although you can. You can, even while you're crossing the threshold into your home office, just stop at the doorway for a second, maybe close your eyes, and might say it in words. I'm entering workspace now, including mental workspace, and then take the rest of the steps in.
So you mentioned something so a few things is actually really important here. So you mentioned, in terms of one of the structures that people are missing who were used to working in an office, is they had the commute time, which was an opportunity to transition emotionally and physically from workspace and work life, and from home life and home space to work life and workspace. And one of the recommendations that you gave is to reclaim that, is to put up the, if you're able to have a separate space for your work in your home, and if you have a small space, someone was putting up a curtain. So you have that, and then you mentioned having some kind of ritual that triggers for you what the commute time did, which is the start and the stop of your day. So in my work with clients, I call this reclaiming your commute time. And I talk about the example of Mr. Rogers. So many of us who are familiar with Mr. Rogers, when he started the lesson for the day, he'd come in, and there was this switching of the sweater and the shoes, and then same thing at the end, right? And so that's an example of a switching or a way to reclaim your commute time and make that switch. Another example I give is for folks that are into comics and superheroes. You can think about Superman. Superman. Clark Kent switches Superman and back and forth, right? And so one of the ways that we signal that is that he goes into the phone booth. Clark Kent, who's dressed in the suit, goes into the phone booth and switches into the costume with the cape, right? And so, if you want to make it fun, you can order yourself a superhero cape, and put that on when you're doing your work, and that can help you to make that mental transition. But it seems like the larger point you're making is that we've lost that commute time, and we need to somehow reclaim it. And so you're giving us ideas about how we can do that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And, the varieties are endless. And the other thing I'd stress, which is true about mindfulness in general, is there's a lot of personal variation. So, I'm giving ideas or suggestions, but it's really key that you try things out and see what works best for you. Don't necessarily do what's best for me if you find it doesn't work for you. And the other thing that you said, which I'll just emphasize, is these external triggers, the changing clothes, the bowing, or walking through a door. The purpose of them is to trigger an internal change in your state. So whatever works for you, that's the key, is the internal part, really. The external, just like meditating, you ring a bell. The bell doesn't meditate for you. It's something that can help your mind draw its attention in a certain direction. So if you don't need the clothes changing, then don't do it. But find something that works for you. And the test is, does it help you make that mental state change into work mode?
Yeah, I think that's powerful. And I think one of the things I would add to that is that, in terms of the ritual, that it doesn't have to be something that's necessarily connected to work. And so for lots of folks, this is an opportunity to probably do something that they didn't have time to do before. And so maybe they actually have time to have breakfast as a family.
Yeah.
Maybe they have time to sit with the dog or the cat and just drink their cup of tea or cup of coffee or whatever it is, right? So that can be something that you can do as well. Do you have examples of how? So you talked about how we can start the day and make that switch to work. Do you have any examples that we can use in terms of how do we turn off work?
Yeah. Here's one. Again, works for me. Maybe it doesn't work for other people, but I like to, at the end of the day, do some planning for how I'm going to start the next day. So it serves, for me, it's like double duty. It both helps me make a transition. It's like a reminder to me that my day is ending, because now I'm switching my attention to the next day. It also helps ease my anxiety for the whole rest of the night about the next morning. If I do find my mind wandering out of the present, into the next morning, and what am I going to do? I can think back to that plan I made, and it helps ease my anxiety. So it's both a transition at the end, and sometimes I also, and it depends on how much you have physical stuff. Some people, now that they're virtual, just have a computer and not a lot of physical stuff. I also like to kind of physically tidy up the workspace. For me, it's mostly papers around the computer, but that's another thing that is like, it's a reminder to myself that now I'm transitioning out of work. I'm putting that stuff physically in place. So those are a couple of examples.
And those are really good examples. And I think the first one I want to talk about really briefly, which you talked about sort of wrapping up your day and planning the next day. It's such an important ritual, particularly for busy folks. And I work with a lot of parents that have the mental checklist they go through, not just for work, but also for their kids and for their family. And it's such an important way to lower your anxiety level, because you are not unconsciously worrying about what's coming next, because you already know, right? You've relieved yourself of that uncertainty, and so what I recommend that to my clients, and I do that myself, where I'm doing two things. Number one, I am reviewing what I accomplished that day. I'm checking off what I accomplished, and I'm reviewing what I didn't accomplish, and I'm viewing that in a non-judgmental way. I'm just saying, you know what, I didn't get to write that email to Robert today, and I'm not beating myself up about it. I'm just saying, you know what, I didn't get to that today. I'm going to move that to my list for tomorrow, right? Or I realize that that's no longer important, so I'm going to take it off my list, right? Or I'm going to move it to another day in my calendar. Whatever it is, you are reviewing your day, you're preparing yourself for the next day. And the other thing that's really important is, many of us, with the nature of the work that we do, we have lots of meetings, right?
Yes.
And so it's so important, I've found for myself, to just glance at my calendar to know what I have coming up, right? So I'm not caught off guard. I know if I have any prep work I need to finish, I know that perhaps if I need to actually cancel or move something, I can just do that now, right? And not wait till the last minute, right? I can be respectful of my time and the other person's time. Sometimes other people will cancel, right? And so you don't want to spend your time planning for a meeting that's being canceled, right? So checking your calendar before you end your workday is powerful. So I appreciate you sharing that and offering that. It's such a powerful way, I think, and it just takes a few moments too to do it. Yeah.
In fact, today I had an example. I happen to have an early morning call tomorrow with a client in Australia because of the time zone difference.
Yes.
And so in that case, I ended up looking earlier in the day at my schedule for tomorrow, because if I waited until the end of my day to look at that, I would have then realized I'm not going to have time in the morning to prepare for that call.
Yes.
I need to do it today.
Yes.
Otherwise, I'm going to wake up anxious and I'm going to scramble. And then I either won't be prepared, or I've got to wake up earlier than I need to, and I'm going to lose sleep. So, and you're right, it takes very little time to do this. And the next thing I suggest to people is, because I often hear this objection, what's the point of planning for my next day when 9 times out of 10, within the first hour of that day, my whole plan has gone to pot,
Great question. Yes. So what
So
is the point, Robert? Tell us.
yeah, that's right. At least half the point is actually to affect how you feel about the day.
Yes.
It's about the feeling.
The inner state.
Yeah, your inner state. Now,
Yes.
it is also about making yourself more productive on that day. But the people who say shouldn't bother doing it because it will have no impact on my productivity, I think they're overlooking the significant internal benefit of having some plan in place, even if it's true that early in the day, the next day, you'll have to start rearranging it.
Yes.
It at least lets you start the day off on a more solid footing. And I find it, as I mentioned before, it helps the night before to ease my anxiety for several hours. And that's a
Yes.
huge benefit.
Yes. You sleep better, you lower your anxiety. If you're managing a team, you're able to lower the anxiety of your team folks, because that your team members, because that leadership flows downward. And
Right.
so it impacts not just your inner state, but it also impacts the inner state of your team, as well as their overall productivity and how they approach the work. And I think you point to something that's really important, which is why we're having this conversation, because there are lots of tips and hacks and tools that are aligned with what we're talking about. But what I find to be the missing piece when we talk about sustained long-term positive transformation is the connection between the internal and the external, right? So much of the productivity advice out there as it relates to this particular topic focus solely on the external.
Right.
Right. But that's not sustainable. And it's one of the reasons people burn themselves out. If you're just focusing on the external, right?
Yeah.
And you're not dealing with the internal, you have to deal with them together, right?
Yeah.
You're not gonna have a sustained change, right? You might have some short-term wins.
Yeah.
But you're gonna find yourself in this pattern where you're sort of starting and stopping, where you're good for a second, and then you burn out, and then you got to get back on track, and you repeat this cycle over and over again. Whereas if you are doing what you're suggesting, if I'm hearing you right, if you're tending to the inner state along with the external, you're doing both of those together, then you're sustaining that progress and you're doing it in a way that's sustainable over the long term and not just the short term.
Yeah, I am very focused on efficiency and productivity. That's what you call the external. But I always try to think, when I'm thinking of changing some habit of mine, how will it affect how I feel? And then I use mindfulness in the moment to experiment and try out some new technique, and then see how I actually feel in the moment around it. And that's another way in which it's different for everyone. To put one axis is people fall along a continuum of more planning oriented to being more spontaneous, improvising type of person. I retook the Myers-Briggs test recently, and they call this judgment versus something else. Judgment is like a planner.
Yes.
I was, by my constitution, 100% judgment,
Yes.
I was very extreme. All the other axes, I was much more balanced. So for me, that's partially why a lot of the techniques I use are around structure, routine, schedule. It kind of fits my constitution. I've learned and practiced mindfulness in part to develop a bit of a more of ability to pay attention in the moment and improvise and balance out that planning part of me. But if you are listening and you're someone who says, Robert, my natural way is to take things as they come and improvise on the spot, you might have a different set of tools or techniques that work for me might feel horrible to you, or create anxiety in you, or resistance, or frustration, or resentment.
So can we talk about that? Because I have a training this week, as an example. I'm going to be working with some creatives around digital wellness.
Yeah.
And creatives and artists. So these are folks that they create art for a living. That's the way that they make change in the world. So
Yeah.
can you talk to us about, you know, in the moments that we have left,
Yeah.
these different work styles? So you mentioned that you're more of a planner. So how do you find out what your work style is? And then how do you find out like what are going to be the strategies that are commonly aligned with those different work styles? Can you talk to us
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to give an answer that sounds trite and say just use mindfulness, right? But in a sense, that's half of it, which is how do you find out what your style is and how do you find out what works? You pay attention to what you think and how you feel while you're trying different things, and that's basically applying mindfulness. But so that's part of it. But there's a lot of people have put
Mhm.
a lot of thought and effort into this over the years. So you can take the tests, the Myers-Briggs and other types of tests, and that could give you a little bit of a jump start to understanding yourself. And there's lots of sets of techniques and tools out there that other people have developed for that work better for some quote types than others. And I think the even more interesting thing then you talk about teams. You know, I remember working on this early on when I started my own business was, okay, I learn about myself. Then I learn about other people and then learn, well, what are the common ways in which a person like me would be best to interact with a person of another type? Not to put people into boxes too strictly, but you know, someone who's more of a planner, when they work with someone who's more of an improviser, you know, you're going to have to work together differently than if it's two planners or two improvisers, right?
Mhm.
Um, and that can both be challenging, but also be fun and create a lot of opportunities. You know, when you've got people with different styles who can, you might say, well, they're going to enter into conflict. Yeah, that can be true, but it can also those strengths can complement each other in a lot of ways. How? Well, you have to be conscious of them. And I'll go back to martial arts, you know, saying that if you know yourself, but not your enemy, or let's say the other person, you know, you'll win half the time. And the same if you know the other person and not yourself.
Yes.
And this saying is put in the context of battle, but know yourself and know your enemy. You'll always be victorious. But even if you think of it in a non-conflictual way, right? Know yourself and know the person you're interacting with. You need that self-knowledge and knowledge of the other person if you really want to have a successful relationship and interaction.
So this is really really powerful. So I think this is another piece that separates the type of discussion that we're having from just the what I see often is the strict focus on the external, which
Yeah.
is that we miss these nuances about how our work styles, like what our work styles are, right? And
Yes.
how those impact how we approach to work from an individual space, but also how we approach it when we're working as a collective or as a group. So really,
Mhm.
really, really important um, point that you raise here. So Carlos, if you're there and you're able to come on screen, I want to make sure that we get, you know, any input or any questions from you before we begin to wrap up. So let us know if you have anything that you want to add to the conversation, or you want to ask a question.
Yeah.
Um, and so as we do that, Robert, I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about technology for mindfulness. Tell us what it is very briefly,
Yeah.
and tell us about if you have any additional programs or any
Yeah.
offerings that are coming up that people can take advantage of if they want to dive deeper into this topic that we talked about with you.
Sure. Yeah, Technology for Mindfulness is an organization I founded 5 years ago. We have it helps people to deal with digital distraction, focus, um, and how to be more productive, creative, focused, and generally happy using technology. Deal with really all the types of issues we talked about, and in recent months, focused a lot more on helping people to work from home. And as you said, not just to be productive, but to deal with the feelings and the internal
Yeah.
aspects of it. So we have a podcast, interview people like you, all kinds of people,
Yes. Yeah.
uh, you know, and online courses, webinars, and done some webinars recently on working from home. being productive and staying connected with others, which is not something we talked about so much here. But, how do you stay feeling connected with other people when you're physically distant
Yes.
from them? So you can go to technologyformindfulness.com to really check out everything there.
Okay. And so they can learn more about any upcoming things you have. So go to Technology for Mindfulness, learn more about that. Definitely check out the podcast. It's an excellent podcast. It's essentially, a smorgasbord of conversations just like the one that we're having that dives deeper into some of these nuances that we talked about today. So just in the last few moments that we have with you, can you tell us, you touched on about this relationship piece and physical distancing.
Yeah.
And we're talking about what's happening in the world with COVID. We talked about at the top of the conversation, what's happening with the protests and this conversation that I think we're being forced to have as a nation about social justice. And so how do we use technology in a mindful and intentional way to have those kinds of conversations to stay connected, even though we're physically distancing because of COVID?
Yeah. So that's a huge question that I'll be humble and say, I don't have a good answer. I would just say in general, I've been trying in recent months, just because of COVID in general, when I'm thinking about using technology, sending an email, going on Twitter, reading the news, I'm trying to think, is this use of technology something that's helping me to be more connected with someone else? Or is it creating some sort of a barrier or distance between me, some disconnection between me and the other person? So not that I would never engage in something that's a bit more on the disconnected side, but Twitter is a great example. Actually, I'll be honest, I've almost never used Twitter before COVID, and then started going on it to get COVID news. I've been very careful to follow specific people who I trust and respect, not read other stuff, not dive into rants when it suggests things to me that I find are unhealthy, to use mindfulness. Oh, notice I didn't like that. I don't like how it feels. I don't want to be involved in that kind of interaction, even just on the receiving end. Block it, mute it.
Yes.
So I keep asking, with any way I use technology, is this in service of me being who I want to be and connecting with other people in the way that I want to connect with them? And that's what I use as my guide. So I often find, just as an example, this kind of communication, one-on-one or small group live video stuff, I've generally found has been really connecting for me. There are exceptions, but I found this a real bright spot. I play music with people, and before COVID, there's two groups of people I played with in person, one group every week. It's been really hard to not play together. We get together on Zoom. It's not the same. And I'll just have to say, we're experimenting. And I think this is why I said I need to be humble. There's a lot of experimenting that's going on. I think it's going to have to keep going on as we're trying out new stuff. And how do you experiment? You try something and then you pay attention, mindfulness, pay attention to how it feels, how well it works, and then you tweak and try again and pay attention and tweak. Once you stop paying attention, that's when you can get involved in a cycle of using technology that may not be so healthy to you and start gravitating into that more addictive mode of use rather than productive, healthy mode of use.
Well, Robert, this has been so insightful. And if I were just to summarize all of the advice that you gave us, it would be with two words: pay attention. It sounds like that is that's the key. It's simple and complex at the same time, but you've given us a lot to think about, a lot to consider. We appreciate your time, and we're grateful that you joined us. And I'm hopeful that we can have you back again to unpack some of the things we didn't get to today. So as we wrap up, Carlos, is there anything that you want to let us know before we close out today with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, equally grateful to you, Robert, for all the sort of like nuggets of knowledge that you've shared with us today. I agree with Miko. It feels like there might be an opportunity to do round 2 or part 2 of this discussion. So the invitation is open, Robert. And the other sort of note that I wanted to make is also sort of thank you, Miko, for today and just taking some time to create space to acknowledge the current sort of events and really helping ourselves in this conversation and those that are watching to, again, sort of like be mindful and take some time and sort of say, yep, like that's real, it's happening, and sort of enter into perhaps action with a level head. So again, thank you for starting us off in that way. I mean, I think other than that, again, thank you for everybody that chimed in. We'll have this recording available to share probably as early as today. So be on the lookout for that.
All right, awesome. So thank you all for that. Robert, was there something else you wanted to add?
Just no, thanks to you and Carlos for having me, and thanks Miko for restating the things I've said in a much better way than I said.
Well, I'm happy. So you can take the video and get the transcript, and you can do what you need to do with it to make it your own.
Thank you.
Well, awesome. I appreciate this, and for the viewers that are watching, thank you so much for tuning in, for commenting, for liking, for sharing. If you found this valuable, I invite you to share this with someone, drop their name into the comments or tag them. And of course, you can follow me on social media at @amindfultechie. And then you can go to mindfultechie.com, join the email list to stay updated on all things mindfulness and technology and wellness. And until next time, we will see you. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you.
Guys. Have a good day.
Now. Bye.